By the late 1950s, Cushman was building 15,000 motor scooters a year in Lincoln and Nebraska. The Eagle, an American machine ridden by students and soldiers and working fathers, shipped from a union factory on the plains to dealerships in every state. Then, decision by decision, it was given away. A corporate acquisition that turned a scooter company into a marine engine subsidiary. A failed deal to distribute Italian Vespas instead of reinventing the Eagle. A final shutdown. The last Silver Eagle rolling off the line in 1966, while Honda sold machines by the tens of thousands to the customers Cushman had abandoned. The factory kept running. It builds golf carts now. The site at 2100 Vine is slated for apartments. This is the story of how two cousins built a basement engine shop into America's scooter empire, and how a corporation dismantled the only part of it that people loved, not through failure, through a choice that looked reasonable on paper and cost Lincoln its most famous machine. The story starts in Lincoln, Nebraska, on a street called Vine, not because Vine Street is famous, because what used to stand there was. For most of the 20th century, 2100 Vine was a factory address. Engines were built there. Scooters were assembled there. War contracts were fulfilled there. A union local bargained there for decades. And for a stretch of years in the 1950s, that address shipped more motor scooters than any other place in America. Roughly 15,000 a year, crated and sent to dealerships in every state, bought by high school kids, small business owners, adults who needed a second set of wheels, and military depots that needed something light and fast and cheap. Today, the tract at 2100 Vine is a redevelopment zone. The University of Nebraska owns the land. The plans call for housing, retail, maybe some community space. The language is forward-looking. Unity Commons, mixed use, senior living, international community center. It's the language cities use when the ground beneath them has forgotten what it used to make. The company that made 2100 Vine Matter didn't die there. That's the part of the story most people miss. The company survived. The brand still exists, stamped on utility vehicles owned today by Textron. What died at 2100 Vine was something more specific and more painful. An American-made motor scooter for ordinary people. A machine that cost less than a car, went faster than a bicycle, and for 30 years gave working families and teenagers and paperboys something that felt, for the price, like freedom. It died not because the market vanished. The market was booming. It died because the men who owned the company decided freedom wasn't profitable enough. The man who started it all never imagined scooters. His name was Everett Cushman, and in 1901, he and his cousin Clinton were thinking about engines. Everett B. Cushman and Clinton Cushman weren't dreamers in any romantic sense. They were tinkerers, Midwestern mechanics who understood gasoline engines at a moment when most of rural America still ran on muscle and steam. In 1901, in Lincoln, they started building small two-cycle gasoline engines, not in a factory, in the basement spaces and workshops available to men without capital, in a city that was itself still figuring out what it wanted to be. Lincoln, at the turn of the century, was a state capital and a university town, but it wasn't yet an industrial city. The Cushmans weren't building where manufacturing tradition ran deep. They were building where land was cheap, labor was willing, and nobody was going to tell them their idea was too small to matter. The engines they made were utilitarian. Pumps, cream separators, washing machines, feed grinders, buzz saws, the invisible mechanical backbone of plains life. These weren't glamorous products. They were the machines that kept farms running and small operations solvent in a region where distance was the defining problem and a reliable engine could save a man a week's labor. A patent filed by Everett and his brother Leslie in 1906 describes a gas engine improvement. The language is dense, technical, the work of men who understood combustion from the inside out. That patent is one of the earliest pieces of hard evidence that the Cushmans weren't just assemblers. They were engineers solving specific mechanical problems and protecting their solutions. The business grew the way Midwestern businesses grew in that era, slowly, practically, without venture capital or national press. The Cushman Motor Works became a real manufacturer, moving from basements into proper facilities, hiring local workers, building a reputation that traveled by word of mouth along the same dirt roads their engines served. By By the 1910s and 1920s, Cushman was an established Lincoln enterprise, not famous, not wealthy, but steady, an engine company in a city that needed engines. What matters about this early history isn't the product, it's the pattern. The Cushmans survived by reading the market and adapting. When one application for their engines softened, they found another. When agriculture needed something, they built it. When a new use for a small gasoline motor appeared, they chased it. That adaptability would define the company for 6 decades. It would also, in the end, destroy the thing that made it great, because the same instinct that led them into scooters would eventually lead them out. But that was decades away. In the early 1930s, what the Cushmans faced was more immediate. The Depression. Engine sales slowed. The agricultural economy that had sustained them was collapsing. And somewhere in the Lincoln plant, someone asked the question that would change everything the company was. What if we put our engines on wheels? We tell the stories of what America built and how it fell apart. If that's your thing, subscribe. More of these are coming. Now let's get back to the story. The idea wasn't glamorous, and nobody at Cushman would have called it visionary. It was arithmetic. They had small, reliable engines. They had a factory that could bend and weld steel. Somewhere in America, there were people who needed to get from one place to another and couldn't afford a car or a motorcycle. What if you built a machine that fit in the gap? Something between a bicycle and a motorcycle. Something cheap, simple, and powered by the same kind of engine Cushman had been perfecting for 35 years. In 1936, Cushman put its first motor scooter on the market. The Smithsonian's own description of the company frames the scooter line in exactly those terms, not as invention for its own sake, but as a practical answer to a market problem. Cushman didn't dream up a new category. They saw an empty space between two existing ones and filled it with something their plant could already build. The early scooters were rough, step-through frames, small wheels, engines that owed more to lawnmower engineering than to motorcycle design. They weren't fast, they weren't beautiful, but they were cheap, and they ran. And in Depression-era and late Depression America, a machine that could carry a grown adult across town for a few dollars worth of gasoline was not a novelty. It was a solution. Sales grew. Not explosively. This was still a Nebraska manufacturer with a regional dealer network and no national advertising budget. But the scooters moved. Delivery companies bought them. Small businesses used them. Teenagers discovered them. And Cushman discovered something the founders hadn't anticipated. The scooter business had an emotional dimension the engine business never had. Nobody dreamed about a cream separator motor, but a kid on a scooter? That was something else. That was independence in mechanical form, available for the price of a summer's worth of lawn mowing money. Then the war came, and Cushman discovered that the United States military also had a use for a small, cheap, reliable machine that could carry a man and his gear across terrain too rough for a jeep and too far for legs. Between 1941 and 1945, Cushman became something more than a Lincoln manufacturer. The company became part of the war machine, and the scale of that transformation is easy to understate from a distance of 80 years. Cushman built military scooters, the Model 53, the airborne scooter, designed to be compact enough for paratroop operations, tough enough for field conditions, and simple enough that a 19-year-old with a wrench and a manual could keep it running. These weren't consumer products with olive drab paint. They were purpose-built for a military that needed light, portable transport in theaters from North Africa to the Pacific. But the scooters weren't the whole wartime story. Cushman held substantial government contracts beyond two-wheeled vehicles. Women joined the workforce at the Lincoln plant, assembling bomb fuses from mostly steel components. Repetitive, precise, essential work done at benches in a factory that had been retooled almost overnight from peacetime production to ordnance. The Great Plains wartime production records document the reality plainly. Lincoln's Cushman plant was one of Nebraska's significant war industry operations, part of the vast inland production network that turned Midwestern factories into arsenals. The war years did 3 things to Cushman that shaped everything after. First, they proved the company could manufacture at scale and under pressure. A plant that had been building engines and small batch scooters was now running shifts, meeting military specifications, and delivering on government deadlines. That's a different kind of operation, and it left Cushman with expanded capacity and manufacturing confidence. Second, the war built the workforce. Men and women who'd come into the plant for war production didn't all leave when the war ended. The union, Local 907, was already bargaining contracts by 1946, establishing the labor relationship that would run for decades. Those contracts, documented in labor archives from the mid-1940s into the 1990s, traced the arc of a factory that was, for most of a half-century, a union shop with negotiated wages, benefits, and the kind of stability that built lives. Third, and most importantly, the war created demand. Millions of Americans who'd never thought about scooters had now seen them. Returning servicemen who'd ridden military Cushmans in training camps and staging areas came home with a simple piece of knowledge: those machines worked. And in post-war America, a country of new suburbs, expanding highways, rising wages, and a hunger for mobility that the automobile industry couldn't fully satisfy at the price point every family could afford, that knowledge mattered. Cushman came out of the war ready to build, ready to sell, ready to become something the cousins in their basement workshop could never have imagined. They just needed the right machine. In 1949, Cushman introduced the Eagle, and everything changed. Not overnight, not with a single magazine ad or a splashy launch event. Cushman was still a Nebraska company, and Nebraska companies didn't do things that way. But the Eagle was different from anything Cushman had built before, and the difference wasn't subtle. The earlier scooters had been utilitarian, small-wheeled, step-through, the mechanical equivalent of sensible shoes. The Eagle looked like it wanted to move. Larger wheels, a longer frame, chrome trim that caught the light, a Husky engine, Cushman's own, that gave the machine enough power to feel real on a county road, not just adequate in a parking lot. By 1950, Cushman was building 10,000 scooters a year. Within a few years, the number would climb to 15,000, and the Eagle was the reason. It was the first Cushman scooter that sold aspiration alongside transportation. A kid who saved enough to buy an Eagle wasn't just buying a way to get to school or a paper route. He was buying the feeling of the road opening up, the wind pulling at his jacket, the particular thrill of operating a machine that answered to his right hand and nobody else's. Imagine the Lincoln plant in 1952 or 1953 running near capacity. The morning shift arriving, men mostly in those years, parking along streets that had been residential a generation earlier and were now absorbed into the factory's gravitational pull. The plant, at its post-war height, wasn't one building. It was a campus, multiple structures connected by the logic of production, each one handling a stage of the process that turned raw steel, aluminum, rubber, and paint into a finished scooter. The smell hit you before you reached the floor. Machine oil, that particular mineral sharpness that clings to clothing and skin and doesn't wash out so much as fade into the background of a working life. Beneath it, the metallic bite of fresh-cut steel, the chemical sweetness of paint from the finishing department, the rubber and grease scent of assembled wheels waiting for installation. These weren't unpleasant smells to the men who worked there. They were the smell of a paycheck, the smell of a Tuesday, the smell of normal. On the floor, the sound was constant, not deafening the way a steel mill or a stamping plant was deafening. Cushman built smaller machines, and the processes were lighter, but persistent. The whine of drill presses, the rhythmic punch of metal-forming equipment, the rattle of the assembly conveyors, the clang of a dropped wrench echoing off concrete, and underneath it all, the low hum of the ventilation system pushing air through a space that generated heat from 100 machines running simultaneously. A new hire would notice every sound. A man who'd been there 5 years heard only the silences, the skipped beat that meant something had stopped that shouldn't have. The scooters moved through the plant in stages, frames welded and ground smooth, engines assembled from components machined on site, pistons, cylinders, crankshafts, each one checked against tolerances that the old-timers could feel in their hands before a gauge confirmed it. Wiring harnesses laid in. Wheels mounted. Paint, those signature Cushman colors, the reds and the whites and the two tones that would become collectible half a century later, applied and cured. And at the end of the line, a finished Eagle rolled to the loading dock, crated and shipped to a dealer who already had a buyer waiting. Local 907's contracts covered the men and women who did this work. Union wages, negotiated benefits. The kind of arrangement that let a line worker in Lincoln, Nebraska own a house, raise a family, put something away. Not wealth. Nobody got rich assembling scooters, but sufficiency. The American industrial bargain in miniature. You show up, you do the work, you go home to a life the work made possible. The community around the plant was shaped by it the way water shapes a riverbed, gradually, completely. The diners where the morning shift ate breakfast, the bars where the second shift unwound, the neighborhoods within driving distance where Cushman paychecks paid mortgages. Lincoln wasn't a one-factory town the way Gary was a U.S. Steel town, or Flint was a GM town, but Cushman was woven into the city's identity tightly enough that Nebraska promotional material in the late 1950s cited the company with pride, an enterprise founded in 1901, nationally known, exporting American-made machines from the plains. And who rode those machines? That's where the Cushman story separates itself from every other small manufacturer narrative of the 1950s. The Eagle didn't belong to one demographic. High school students bought them, or begged their parents to buy them, because an Eagle was freedom at 16, a way out of the house and into the world. Adults bought them as second vehicles, cheaper than a car, easier to park, practical for commutes that didn't require four wheels and a trunk. Small businesses bought them for deliveries. The military kept buying them for base transport and logistics. Cushman's market wasn't a niche. It was a cross-section of American life, united by a single principle: affordable mobility. The Smithsonian puts it plainly. Cushmans were popular with students, adults needing supplementary transportation, and small businesses. That breadth is the dominance story. Cushman didn't win one corner of the market. It occupied the center. By the late 1950s, 15,000 scooters a year, a name recognized nationally. A union workforce building a product that people loved. Not in the way they loved a Cadillac or a Corvette, but in the way you love a machine that actually shows up in your life and changes what's possible. The Eagle was never the most powerful thing on the road. It was the most accessible. And in post-war America, accessibility was the game. Set yourself in 1958, maybe 1959. The Eagle is Cushman's flagship, the model that appears in dealer brochures and collector dreams alike. The plant is producing at or near its peak, 15,000 scooters annually, plus the industrial vehicles and utility machines that round out the product line. Nebraska's own promotional literature treats Cushman as a point of state pride, a company with origins stretching to 1901 and a national footprint built from the middle of the country outward. From the outside, Cushman looked fully established, a half-century-old brand, a loyal customer base spanning demographics, a product line that had survived the Depression, retooled for a world war, and ridden the post-war boom to record volumes. The union contracts were stable. The dealer network was in place. The Eagle had given the company something most manufacturers spend decades chasing: cultural recognition. People knew the name. People wanted the product. The scooter wasn't just a machine Cushman happened to build. It was what Cushman meant. But the view from inside had already shifted in ways the outside couldn't see. In 1957, Cushman had been acquired by the Outboard Marine Corporation, OMC, in a stock transaction that made the Lincoln Scooter Company a subsidiary of a much larger, diversified manufacturer. OMC's business was marine engines, outboard motors, boats. They made Johnson and Evinrude. They were publicly traded, nationally operated, and governed by the logic of a portfolio. Multiple product lines evaluated against each other for returns, growth potential, capital allocation. On paper, the acquisition looked like strength. Cushman gained the resources and reach of a major corporation. OMC gained a profitable subsidiary with an established brand and a loyal market. The deal was reported as a consolidation, not a takeover. The language was optimistic. By 1962, trade publications were describing Cushman not just as an OMC subsidiary, but as an OMC division. That shift in language, subsidiary to division, sounds bureaucratic. It wasn't. A subsidiary retains some identity, some operational independence. A division is a line item. A division competes for capital against other divisions. A division's product line survives only as long as the parent company believes that line serves the portfolio better than the alternatives. 15,000 scooters a year, a name that meant something in every state, a workforce in Lincoln that had been building these machines through depression, war, and boom. And now the decisions about what Cushman would build, and whether it would keep building scooters at all, were being made by men whose primary business was marine engines, in boardrooms where the Eagle was one product among dozens. That was the summit. The view was clear. The ground was already shifting beneath it. The threat didn't announce itself with a press conference or a declaration of war. It arrived on two wheels, weighed under 200 pounds, and came with a smile. In 1959, the Honda Motor Company opened its first American storefront, a small operation in Los Angeles, modest by any standard, selling machines most American dealers had never seen. The Super Cub was Honda's flagship for the U.S. push, a small displacement motorcycle, step-through frame, automatic clutch, a machine so simple and so clean that it looked like it had been designed by someone who'd studied every complaint Americans had ever lodged against motorcycles and fixed them all at once. No oil leaks. No kickstarting drama, no greasy-handed mystique. You turned a key, twisted a throttle, and rode. Cushman's management in Lincoln would have heard about Honda early. The power sports trade wasn't large enough for a new entrant to go unnoticed, especially one backed by a Japanese manufacturer that was already dominant in Asia. But hearing about a competitor and understanding what that competitor represents are different things. Honda wasn't just selling a machine. Honda was selling an idea. That motorized two-wheel transport didn't have to be rough, loud, mechanical, or vaguely dangerous. It could be pleasant, it could be clean, it could be something your mother wouldn't mind you riding. By 1963, that idea had a campaign behind it. You meet the nicest people on a Honda. The advertisements showed college students, young professionals, women in skirts, couples on weekend outings, a world away from the leather jacket imagery that had clung to American motorcycles since Hollister and the Wild One. The campaign didn't just sell Hondas, it redefined the market Cushman had quietly owned for 20 years. The affordable mobility customer, the student, the commuter, the small business operator, suddenly had a new option, and that option came wrapped in a message engineered to make the old option look outdated. The numbers tell the rest. Honda's U.S. sales climbed from a few thousand units in 1960 to tens of thousands by the mid-1960s. Every Honda sold to a student or a commuter was a sale that might once have gone to a Cushman dealer, and Honda wasn't alone. Yamaha, Suzuki, and Kawasaki followed, each one bringing Japanese manufacturing precision, lower price points, and marketing that spoke directly to the youth demographic Cushman had cultivated but never aggressively defended. A Cushman dealer in 1962 could see the shift happening at the street level, in conversations that didn't require a market research report to interpret. A kid would come in, look at an Eagle, ask about the weight, the top speed, the starting mechanism, then he'd mention a Honda dealership across town. The questions he was asking weren't hostile, they were comparative. And comparative shopping, in a market where Cushman had long been the only real option in its price class, was itself the signal that the world had changed. Cushman's Eagles were tough. They were American-made. They had a following built over decades. But they were heavier than a Super Cub, less refined, and engineered on principles that owed more to the 1940s than to the post-war Japanese manufacturing revolution. The Husky engine was reliable. Decades of service in the field proved that, but it wasn't elegant. It wasn't modern. And in a market suddenly flooded with machines that started easier, ran smoother, looked sharper, and cost the same or less, reliable and American was no longer enough. The import wave didn't hit Cushman the way a recession hits. It wasn't a single quarter of bad numbers. It was a gradual reweighting of consumer expectations. Month by month, dealer by dealer, the ground shifting under a company that had never before had to defend its core market against a competitor with deeper pockets, better design, and a message that resonated with the very customers Cushman had spent 2 decades cultivating. Honda was outspending Cushman on advertising by a ratio that made the comparison absurd. The Nicest People campaign ran in life, in look, in mainstream publications where Cushman had never advertised and couldn't afford to. Honda wasn't playing the same game at a higher level. It was playing a different game entirely, one where brand image mattered as much as the machine, where the feeling of owning the product was as carefully engineered as the product itself. Inside the OMC portfolio, the implications were legible to anyone reading the sales reports. The scooter line, once the most culturally visible piece of the Cushman business, was now the most threatened. Golf carts weren't fighting Honda. Trucksters, the three-wheeled utility vehicles Cushman built for airports, warehouses, and campuses, weren't competing with Yamaha. The industrial side of the business had captive markets, institutional buyers, steady demand. The scooter side had teenagers and commuters were walking into Honda dealerships. The question hanging over Lincoln wasn't whether Honda was a threat. Everyone knew. The question was what Cushman, or more precisely what OMC, intended to do about it. The answer, when it came, was not what anyone on the factory floor would have guessed. Instead of redesigning the Eagle, investing in a lighter frame, a more modern engine, the kind of engineering refresh that might have met Honda on its own terms, Cushman's management looked across the Atlantic. In a deal effective January 1st, 1961, Cushman became a non-exclusive U.S. distributor for Piaggio's Vespa. The logic had a surface reasonableness that makes it worth examining closely, because reasonable-looking logic is exactly how companies lose wars. Honda and the Japanese manufacturers were pressuring the market with modern, lightweight machines at aggressive prices. Cushman's own scooter line was aging. Redesigning and retooling the Eagle for a new generation would take years and cost capital. Capital that, inside OMC's portfolio, would have to be justified against competing claims from the Marine Division, the outboard motor business, the other product lines that made OMC what it was. Distributing Vespa was faster, cheaper, lower risk. You didn't have to retool a factory. You just had to sign a contract, set up a supply chain, and let your existing dealer network sell an established European brand alongside the American one. On paper, it looked like hedging. In practice, it was an admission. Cushman's management was conceding, whether they said so publicly or not, that the company's own scooter wasn't enough to hold the market. The machine that Everett Cushman's engine company had created from Depression-era arithmetic, that the Lincoln plant had built through a world war and a consumer boom, that 15,000 Americans a year had been riding home from dealerships, that machine, management believed, needed a European supplement to survive. Consider what that decision felt like inside the Lincoln plant. You're a line worker in 1961. You've been building Eagles. Your hands know the assembly sequence: frame, engine, wiring, wheels, paint. And now the company is importing Italian scooters and asking your dealer network to sell them alongside the machine you build. The message isn't subtle. Management doesn't think your machine is enough anymore. Management is looking for a lifeboat, and they aren't building it in Lincoln. The Vespa deal failed. Not slowly, not ambiguously. It failed. Federal court records from the later litigation between Cushman and Piaggio state the essential fact with the flatness of legal language. Vespa sales in the United States fell far below the expectations of both parties, driven by the same Japanese competition that was eroding Cushman's own sales. The imports that had created the problem for Cushman created the same problem for Vespa. A European scooter distributed through a Nebraska company's dealer network was not the answer to a Japanese invasion. It was a detour that consumed management attention, dealer energy, and institutional confidence during the years when all three should have been focused on one thing: building a better American scooter. The litigation record preserves a scene that the trade press never dramatized. Cushman and Piaggio, two companies that had entered the arrangement hoping to survive the same threat, sitting across from each other in federal court, arguing over the wreckage of a deal that was supposed to save both of them. Cushman pointing at Piaggio's product, Piaggio pointing at Cushman's distribution, each side framing the failure as the other's fault. And Honda, unmentioned in the courtroom, untroubled by the proceedings, continuing to sell machines by the tens of thousands to the customers both Cushman and Vespa were losing. By January 1962, Cushman moved to cancel the Piaggio arrangement, with termination effective January 31st, 1963. The deal had lasted, functionally, about 2 years. 2 years during which the Eagle aged further, 2 years during which Honda's Nicest People campaign redrew the boundaries of the American scooter market. 2 years during which the men at OMC headquarters could look at the scooter line's trajectory, their own scooter and the distributed Vespa both declining, and see exactly the kind of curve that makes portfolio managers reach for the simplest, coldest tool in the kit. Not reinvention, not reinvestment, abandonment. They didn't have to kill the scooter line. They could have invested. They could have hired engineers with fresh ideas, authorized a clean sheet redesign, committed the capital and the patience that a genuine competitive response would have required. Honda's own rise had not been instantaneous. Soichiro Honda had spent years developing machines that lost money before the Super Cub found its market. The process of competing is the process of persisting, and Cushman, with its brand recognition, its dealer network, its factory, and its workforce, had assets that a startup could only dream of. But competing meant betting on scooters, betting on a consumer market being redefined by imports, at a time when the safer bets were sitting right there on the other side of the Cushman product catalog. Golf carts, trucksters, industrial vehicles, machines that sold to institutions, not teenagers, machines with captive markets and predictable demand, machines that didn't require Cushman to outdesign Honda or outmarket a Japanese advertising revolution, machines that fit the OMC portfolio the way a socket wrench fits a bolt, precisely, mechanically, without the friction of uncertainty. The Vespa failure didn't cause the death of the Cushman scooter, but it closed the last door that might have led somewhere else. After Vespa, there was no external solution. After Vespa, the only remaining option was to build from within. And building from within required a commitment that OMC's leadership was no longer willing to make. The end, when it came, was quiet. No announcement on the evening news, no workers marching with signs outside the gates, no governor flying in to beg for a reprieve. The death of the Cushman scooter was administered internally, by memo and by calendar, the way a corporation ends a product line that no longer justifies its allocation. Mainstream historical sources, the Smithsonian among them, date the end of Cushman's scooter manufacturing to 1965. That's the year the public record closes the chapter. But the specialist evidence, the collector bulletins and dealer communications that survive in enthusiast archives, tells a slightly different story. The Trailster, one of the last scooter models, ended production in 1965, but the Silver Eagle, the final inheritor of the machine that had defined Cushman for a generation, held on a few months longer. A dealer bulletin dated February 25, 1966, announced the end of Silver Eagle production. The remaining inventory would be sold. After that, nothing. The difference between 1965 and February 1966 is not, in the usual sense, significant. A few months, a bureaucratic lag between a decision made and a production line fully emptied. But the gap matters for what it reveals about how the ending actually felt inside the plant. This wasn't a single day when the line stopped and everyone went home. It was a wind down, a slow deceleration, models dropping off one by one, the scooter section of the factory growing quieter while the industrial vehicle side kept running. Staged deaths are harder to grieve than sudden ones, because there's no single moment to point to and say, that's when it happened. The weekly rhythm changed first. Fewer scooter frames entering the welding stations. Fewer engines pulled from parts inventory for two-wheel assembly. The paint booth running less frequently on Eagle colors. Those reds, those whites, those two tones that had shipped to dealers for years. And then the small, accumulating absences that a line worker would notice before any memo confirmed them. A parts bin not restocked, a fixture not repaired, a tooling station cleaned and left idle. The infrastructure of a product line doesn't disappear overnight. It thins. By 1966, the man publicly identified with the Cushman business was Curtis T. Morris, a manager whose name appears in trade coverage of the period. Morris inherited a division that had already made its choice. The scooter line was gone or going. The future was trucksters, golf carts, utility vehicles, the machines that OMC's portfolio logic had favored, and that the market, as OMC read it, would sustain. Morris wasn't the architect of the scooter's death. He was its undertaker, the person charged with managing the business that remained after the most famous part of it had been quietly removed. Think about what that transition looked like from the factory floor. You're a line worker in Lincoln. You've been building Eagles or Trailsters or Silver Eagles, maybe for 5 years, maybe for 15. You're a member of Local 907. Your wages are negotiated, your benefits are real, and you haven't lost your job. That's important. The Cushman plant didn't close. The layoffs, if they came, were targeted at scooter line positions that didn't transfer to the industrial side. Many workers stayed. The union stayed. The contracts continued. What changed was what you were making. Yesterday you built a machine a 17-year-old saved all summer to buy, a machine a father rode to his second job, a machine that showed up in dealer showrooms with chrome and color and the implicit promise of the open road, however short the road and however modest the chrome. Today you're building a 3-wheeled vehicle for an airport baggage operation, or a golf cart for a country club in Florida, or an industrial hauler for a warehouse distribution center in Ohio. The work is steady. The paycheck clears. The plant is open, but something has left the building that no utility vehicle will replace. The thing that made strangers in other states know the name Cushman, the machine that had carried the brand from Lincoln into American culture. That thing is gone. And the market it served? That market is growing. Honda is selling more machines every year. Yamaha is expanding its U.S. dealer network. The youth scooter and a motorcycle market is climbing through the 1960s and into the 1970s, fed by demographics, by counterculture, by the baby boom hitting driving age, by rising disposable income among young Americans who want exactly the kind of affordable independence Cushman once provided. The customers Cushman walked away from didn't stop buying. They just stopped looking for an Eagle in the showroom. They found a Super Cub instead, or a Yamaha, or a Suzuki. The machines were different. The desire was the same. That is the cruelest fact in this story. Cushman didn't leave a dying market. OMC's executives looked at a market that was growing fast, growing in exactly the demographic Cushman had pioneered, and decided it wasn't worth the fight. They had cheaper products to sell to easier customers. Golf carts don't compete with Honda. Trucksters don't need national advertising campaigns or youth market positioning. The industrial vehicle business was a portfolio manager's dream. Predictable, institutional, insulated from the teenage whims that made the scooter market volatile and the import competition that made it expensive to defend. Every one of those calculations was defensible. Every memo that recommended the pivot could have been written by a competent MBA with a straight face. The numbers supported the decision. The risk profile favored it. The OMC board, evaluating capital allocation across a diversified corporation, had no obvious reason to keep pouring resources into a consumer scooter line that was losing share to Japanese imports when the same factory could build something steadier. And that's what makes it tragic. Not that the decision was made by fools or villains, but that it was made by reasonable men applying reasonable logic to a situation where reasonableness led directly to surrender. They gave away the market. They gave away the name's meaning. They gave away what Cushman was. And they did it because the spreadsheet told them to. The last Silver Eagles rolled off the line and into crates. The dealer bulletin went out. The tooling was either repurposed or shelved. Somewhere in the plant, the welding stations that had joined scooter frames for 3 decades went cold. The paint booth that had sprayed Eagle Red and Highland White ran its last 2-wheel job. The final test ride loop around the plant's perimeter, that short ride where a finished scooter was checked one last time before crating, happened and then didn't happen again. Nobody held a funeral. The product just stopped. The Cushman name didn't disappear. That's the part of the aftermath that separates this story from the classic Rust Belt narrative, where the factory closes and the town empties, and the name becomes a synonym for what went wrong. Cushman kept operating. The Lincoln plant kept running, building trucksters and utility vehicles and golf carts, machines that sold quietly, steadily to airports and universities, and resort properties and municipal fleets. The brand passed through subsequent corporate hands over the decades. Today, Cushman is part of Textron Specialized Vehicles, still manufacturing utility and turf care vehicles, still stamping the name on products that serve institutional customers in a dozen industries. But survival is not the same as continuity. What survived was the company's industrial function, its capacity to manufacture, to ship, to invoice. What was lost was its cultural meaning. Nobody saves a truckster in their garage for 50 years. Nobody restores a golf cart to showroom condition and trailers it to a swap meet on a July weekend. Nobody tells their grandchildren about the summer they earned enough to buy a three-wheeled airport baggage hauler. The machines Cushman builds now are fine machines. They serve their purposes well. They don't carry dreams. The plant site itself tells the same story in concrete and acreage. The property at 2100 Vine, the tract where Everett and Clinton Cushman's engine company grew into a factory, where war contracts were fulfilled, and women assembled fuses on wartime shifts, where Eagles were welded and painted and crated and shipped to every state in the Union, eventually passed to the University of Nebraska. For years, the site has been discussed in the language of urban redevelopment, mixed use, transit-oriented, community-centered. The Unity Commons concept envisions housing, retail, senior living, international community space. The Woodbury Corporation's proposals reference the site's potential for a new kind of neighborhood, forward-looking, diverse, connected to the university campus and the surrounding city. None of that language is wrong. Redevelopment isn't the villain of this story. Cities change. Land gets reused. A city that preserved every former industrial site as a monument would be a city that couldn't grow. The ground at 2100 Vine will almost certainly become something useful, maybe something good. But walk that track today and you'll find no plaque explaining that this was where an American scooter empire lived and died. No marker noting that 15,000 machines a year once shipped from this address to dealerships across the country. No interpretive sign describing the sound the plant made when it ran, or the smell of the paint booth, or the weight of a finished Eagle rolling off the line. The ground has been scraped clean of its industrial memory, and the plans that will fill it carry no obligation to remember what they replaced. The workers who stayed through the transition, who shifted from scooters to industrial vehicles, who kept their local 907 cards and their seniority and their negotiated benefits, had steady employment. That matters, and it shouldn't be dismissed. A paycheck is a paycheck. A house payment made is a house payment made. But the men and women who'd built Eagles knew, in the way that people who make things always know, that something had changed in the character of their work, even if nothing had changed on their pay stub. They'd been making something people wanted. Now they were making something institutions ordered. The difference between want and order is the distance between a love letter and a purchase requisition. Lincoln itself absorbed the change the way mid-sized cities absorb most things. Gradually, without drama, without the catastrophic population loss that defines a Youngstown or a Gary. Cushman wasn't Lincoln's only employer. The university was there. State government was there. The agricultural economy had its own cycles, its own anchors. The loss of the scooter line didn't gut the city. It didn't empty neighborhoods or close schools. It left a hole in the city's story, a hole shaped like an eagle, visible mostly to the people who remembered what used to fill it, and invisible to everyone who came after. What Cushman proved for 30 years was that a company in Lincoln, Nebraska, could build a machine that mattered to people it would never meet. A student in California, a delivery driver in Georgia, a sergeant at a base in Texas, a father in Michigan who needed a second set of wheels and couldn't swing a second car payment. 15,000 times a year, someone walked into a dealership and rode home on a machine assembled by union hands in a Plain State factory, and every one of those transactions carried the same quiet message. You don't need to be rich to move freely. That message didn't die because it was wrong. The market for affordable personal transportation didn't shrink in the 1960s. It exploded. Honda and its Japanese competitors proved that beyond any doubt, they built a global empire on the exact customer base Cushman had cultivated in America for 2 decades. The demand was there. The appetite was there. The demographics were overwhelmingly favorable. More young Americans, more disposable income, More roads, more reasons to ride. What vanished was not the market. What vanished was the American company willing to fight for it. Cushman's scooters ended not because the company failed, but because it chose differently. An acquisition in 1957 folded the brand into a larger corporation whose center of gravity was marine engines, not motor scooters. The corporation evaluated the scooter line against less volatile alternatives and found the scooter wanting. A European distribution deal was tried and abandoned after 2 years of declining sales and rising legal fees. And finally, deliberately, in a series of decisions that escalated from strategic caution to outright retreat, the scooter line was shut down, and the factory's purpose was redefined around machines that would never make a teenager's heart race, but would always clear an institutional procurement review. There's a version of this story that's about globalization, about Japanese imports overwhelming American manufacturing, about trade policy and currency advantages, and the post-war reconstruction of industrial Japan. And that's part of it. Honda was better funded, more innovative, and more aggressive in its marketing than Cushman could afford to match. But globalization doesn't explain a company choosing to leave a growing market. Globalization doesn't explain a factory that was still operating, still profitable in other lines, still employing a union workforce, deciding that the one product giving it a national identity wasn't worth the effort of defending. The imports were the pressure. The choice was Cushman's, or more precisely, OMC's. And the choice was to step aside. The Eagles are still out there, thousands of them, maintained and restored by collectors who understand what the machines represent. Not just mid-century design, but a moment when American manufacturing still believed it could build small, personal, affordable things for ordinary people and compete. At swap meets and scooter rallies across the country, men and women who weren't alive when the last Silver Eagle shipped will spend weekends adjusting Husky engines, polishing chrome fenders, and riding machines built in a Nebraska factory by workers who are mostly gone now. The collectors keep the hardware alive. What they can't keep alive is the possibility. The idea that next year's model might be better, that the factory is still humming, that the American motor scooter is still being made somewhere in Lincoln on a Tuesday afternoon by someone whose hands know the work. That possibility ended on a production line that went quiet one shift at a time, in a factory that kept its other work but lost its reason for being remembered. The ground at 2100 Vine will become something new. The Cushman name will continue on utility vehicles built by a different company for a different world. The Eagle will survive as a collectible, a piece of mid-century Americana polished and preserved in garages and at shows, admired for what it was because nothing replaced what it meant. The scooter empire is gone, not taken by a competitor, not destroyed by a disaster, given away by men who had the factory, the name, the workforce, and the market, and chose a different future because the different future was easier to defend in a quarterly earnings report. The silence at 2100 Vine is not the silence of defeat. It's the silence of a decision. And decisions, unlike disasters, could have gone the other way.